Precisely 3 o'clock in the quiet morning, as the cool dark settled heavy over our 2-story house on the east side of Dayton, the sharp vibration of my smartphone against the nightstand, $9,000 had evaporated into the digital ether in less than 45 minutes. 12 years as a senior investigative reporter at the Dayton Journal had trained my mind never to surrender to the blinding fog of panic when confronted with a sudden domestic crisis. I felt no immediate surge of wild anger, only the cold, crystalline clarity that settles over an investigator at a crime scene when I took a slow, deep breath, letting the steady rhythm of my breathing anchor me in the quiet bedroom as I systematically examined every single transaction listed on my phone. The first charge was an elaborate flight and hotel package to Orlando for nearly $5,000, followed immediately by an expensive electronics order set for local store pickup, and a back-to-back cluster of high-end children's clothing purchases. Every line item represented a deliberate, calculated theft, executed while I slept just 20 feet above the thief. Yet, my professional instincts immediately took command, recording times, exact amounts, and merchant details with methodical, unyielding precision. Instead of rushing downstairs to ignite an emotional, chaotic confrontation, I opened my laptop and began gathering digital evidence with the quiet, practiced thoroughness of an experienced forensic investigator. Connecting directly to our home Wi-Fi router, I reviewed the network traffic logs and browser cache data. Within 10 short minutes, the digital footprint laid bare the undeniable reality of what had transpired in the dark while the rest of our home was completely silent. The flight reservations were booked under the explicit passenger names of my sister-in-law, Serena Miller, and her 2 young children, Leo and Lily, complete with her personal. The online clothing orders were scheduled to ship directly to our home address, utilizing her personal Apple ID profile saved within the device. Watching the unambiguous data confess on the bright screen, I felt a profound, quiet ache for the betrayal, but also an unshakable sense of clarity. Serena had recently lost her job and moved into our guest room under the guise of needing temporary support to get back on her feet. A generous, warm-hearted gesture Ethan and I had gladly extended for the sake of the innocent, vulnerable children. Yet, standing in the cold morning light, I recognized that her desperation had curdled into an arrogant entitlement, leaving a clear, indisputable digital trail that no convenient excuse, emotional deflection. Slipping quietly down the stairs, I approached my leather handbag hanging from its familiar wooden hook beside the kitchen door, the exact spot where my husband Ethan had insisted I keep it for convenience every single evening after returning home from work. I unzipped the wallet and pulled out my credit cards. However, the card immediately behind it was missing. The heavy, platinum corporate card issued by the Dayton Journal, which I utilized strictly for official records requests, public database access, and investigative travel expenses. In the pitch-black darkness of 3 a.m, working quickly out of a purse that was not hers, Serena had reached into the wrong compartment and pulled out the one. Theft of personal property within a family is a painful, complicated domestic tragedy that often gets swept under the rug. But corporate card fraud against a federally insured financial institution triggers an automated, irreversible institutional mechanism. It required a mandatory fraud report, an internal corporate audit, and a signed legal affidavit under strict penalty of perjury before federal banking regulators. Serena had not merely picked my pocket while I slept peacefully upstairs. In her reckless haste, she had reached past every personal card I might have been tempted to forgive out of love for my husband, accidentally stealing the one unique card in our home that answered to no one's family or emotional plea. By 6:30 in the morning, the warm, rich aroma of melting butter and frying eggs filled the kitchen as Serena stood casually at my stove in a brand new robe, humming a casual, cheerful tune while her 2 young children watched morning cartoons in the adjoining den. Looking at this woman, my husband's older sister, whom we had. When I placed my phone face up on the quartz counter, with the fraud alerts glowing brightly in the quiet room, her face did not fall with guilt. Instead, it rearranged itself into a smooth, practiced mask of innocent bewilderment. She casually flipped an egg and claimed that the transactions were obviously the work of sophisticated foreign hackers who routinely used real family names to make fraudulent purchases appear legitimate. However, when I quietly presented the printed Wi-Fi router logs, the digital store pickup receipt attached to her cell phone, and the folded airline confirmation I had retrieved directly from under the wet coffee grounds in the kitchen trash, her defensive, arrogant smile vanished into a tight, cold, and hardened grimace. She did not apologize or express remorse. Rather, her eyes shifted toward the front door, silently waiting for her father Arthur to arrive, trusting completely in the formidable, lifelong protective machinery of family cover-ups that had always stepped in to shield her from facing the real. Within the hour, my father-in-law, Arthur Miller, arrived at our doorstep, his commanding presence filling the kitchen as he sat at my table like a judge taking the bench, declaring with absolute, unyielding, and booming certainty that his daughter would never commit such a crime. He gently patted my hand, offering to write a personal check to cover the missing money if I agreed to call the bank immediately, cancel the fraud reports, and settle the entire matter quietly, neatly, and privately within the inner circle of the family. Looking into it, I calmly, respectfully, but firmly refused his generous offer, explaining that the stolen card belonged to the newspaper and that a formal corporate investigation was already underway and moving forward, far beyond my personal control. I looked him directly in the eye and told him clearly that the purse hanging by the door was not merely a piece of leather, but a quiet, sacred symbol of the unconditional trust, dignity, and open hospitality we had, shielding Serena by taking the blame or lying to an institutional audit would not preserve our family. It would merely destroy my own integrity to finance a destructive illusion. And I refused to burn my own career, professional reputation, and soul to ashes. Monday morning brought no gentle reprieve as the bustling newsroom of the Dayton Journal hummed with its usual frantic energy. Yet a heavy, suffocating shadow hung over my desk. Before I could even unpack my notebook, my editor, Evelyn Vance, a formidable 61-year-old veteran with 35 years of journalistic battle scars, pulled me into her class. She bypassed all pleasantries, her sharp gaze fixing on me with a mixture of solemn concern and unyielding gravity. Evelyn revealed that the newspaper was currently undergoing an unannounced, comprehensive external financial audit in preparation for an upcoming corporate acquisition. The unexpected $9,000 fraudulent spike on my corporate platinum card over the weekend had instantly triggered a red flag within the auditor's automated. Under strict federal banking regulations, an unauthorized charge of that magnitude on a commercial corporate account could not be quietly swept under the rug or settled through informal domestic arrangements. It set off an irreversible, mandatory reporting protocol that escalated directly to the bank's federal fraud division. Sitting in the leather armchair while my morning coffee grew cold, I listened as Evelyn explained the stark, unvarnished, and cold institutional reality before. The institution did not care about family dynamics, delicate Sunday dinners, or bruised domestic pride. It recognized only paper trails, legal liability, and financial accountability. The quiet sanctuary of my professional life had collided head-on with Serena's reckless greed, transforming a domestic betrayal into a high-stakes institutional crisis that demanded an immediate, uncompromising response from everyone involved in this unfolding drama. By Wednesday afternoon, the subtle, insidious machinery of social power and financial leverage began turning against me in a coordinated effort to dismantle my credibility. My father-in-law, Arthur Miller, utilizing his extensive network of country club connections, reached out to his longtime golfing partner, the billionaire owner of the largest regional auto dealership network in Ohio. This auto group happened to be the Dayton Journal's single largest commercial advertiser, single-handedly accounting for nearly 30% of the publication's annual ad revenue each quarter. Capitalizing on this massive economic weight, Arthur's influential friend paid an unexpected visit to our publisher's office, dropping poisonous hints and framing the entire incident as a messy, unfortunate domestic. Within hours, a carefully crafted, malicious rumor began whispering its way through the newsroom corridors, claiming that I had recklessly lent my corporate card to my sister-in-law for a family vacation and was now dishonestly crying fraud to cover up my own professional negligence. Walking past the copy desks, I felt the palpable shift in the air as colleagues I had mentored for years suddenly avoided eye contact. Arthur was operating on a familiar, cynical playbook. When the objective, undeniable facts are against you, destroy the investigator's personal reputation until the truth becomes too expensive for anyone to defend. He believed he could leverage economic pressure to force the newspaper to quiet the matter, underestimating the quiet resilience of a woman whose entire adult life had been dedicated to unearthing hidden truths and holding powerful people accountable for their actions. Late Thursday evening, after the newsroom had cleared, Evelyn called me back into her office, shutting the blinds against the quiet floor and pouring 2 cups of dark, bitter coffee. She looked at me over the rim of her reading glasses with the fierce, protective authority of a mentor who refused to watch one of her sharpest reporters be swallowed by a corporate smear campaign. Evelyn told me plainly that Arthur and his wealthy allies were not trying to disprove my facts. They were attempting to spend my credibility until I could no longer afford to stand by the truth. She urged me to stop viewing the situation as a helpless victim trapped in a painful family tragedy and instead approach it with the cold, methodical rigor of an. They are gambling on your guilt, your silence, and your desire to keep the peace, Maya, she said softly, her voice steady and deeply comforting. Do not attempt to negotiate with people who are terrified of the light. Use your training, gather your paper trail, and let the evidence force them to answer for their choices. Evelyn's words cut through the suffocating fog of isolation that had been building around me, reminding me of who I was beneath the suffocating expectations of my husband's family. I was not a subservient daughter-in-law obliged to absorb another person's crimes. I was a truth teller with a badge, a notebook. On Friday morning, I was summoned to a formal meeting in the legal conference room, where the newspaper's chief corporate counsel laid out the 2 stark, irreversible paths before me, like a dealer turning over 2 face-up cards. He did not sugarcoat the legal reality, placing 2 official documents on the polished mahogany table under the harsh fluorescent lights. Path 1 required me to sign the bank's official affidavit of unauthorized use, swearing under penalty of perjury that I had not authorized the $9,000 charges. Signing this document would legally clear my professional name and transfer the file directly to the Montgomery County Prosecutor's Office. Where Serena? Path 2 required me to sign Arthur's lawyer-drafted statement, falsely declaring that I had granted Serena permission to use the card. Counsel leaned forward, his dry tone delivering a chilling, unvarnished warning about the severe consequences of that choice. Signing Arthur's fraudulent paper meant accepting full personal financial liability for the missing $9,000, facing immediate termination from the Dayton Journal for gross misuse and breach of corporate property, and directly exposing myself to federal felony charges for making a false statement. One paper would put my dishonest, manipulative sister-in-law directly in front of a judge, while the other would destroy my career, my reputation, and send me to prison in her place for a crime I never committed. Looking at the two documents resting side by side on the cold conference table, I felt the last lingering threads of hesitation evaporate from my spirit, replaced by an absolute, quiet resolve. Working in close coordination with Detective Torres, a thorough fraud investigator assigned to the bank's legal division, I methodically and systematically compiled a comprehensive, organized digital evidence binder containing Wi-Fi router. Rather than rushing to sign the affidavit immediately, I strategically chose to utilize the full 10 business day window granted by the banking regulators before submitting the official paperwork. I recognized that Arthur and Serena's overwhelming arrogance was their ultimate vulnerability. By quietly holding my ground, keeping quiet, and letting the clock tick toward the official deadline, I allowed them to spin their elaborate web of lies higher and higher, ensuring beyond doubt that when the heavy hammer of truth finally fell, their manufactured narrative would collapse completely under its own weight. I walked out of the newspaper building into the crisp autumn air. I had reclaimed my narrative, armed with unassailable, concrete digital facts, an unwavering sense of justice, and an ironclad commitment to my own dignity, fully prepared and ready to let the law take its natural course, regardless of the heavy personal cost or the family ties it might sever forever. In the hushed sanctuary of the municipal archive, where the hum of fluorescent lights felt like the steady pulse of a forgotten heartbeat, Maya spent 2 stolen lunch hours peeling back the layers of a carefully curated family mythology. The screen of the microfiche reader cast a pale, ghostly glow across her face as she scrolled through digitized. What she uncovered was not merely a troubled history, but a calculated erasure. Serena had been evicted twice from dilapidated rentals in her 20s and formally charged with pilfering petty cash from a suburban dental clinic where she had briefly worked as a receptionist. Yet, beneath every indictment, like a watermark pressed permanently into the paper, lay the quiet, invisible signature. With the methodical precision of a man sweeping dust under a Persian rug, Arthur had systematically absorbed the financial shockwaves of his sister's transgressions, settling debts out of court and burying police reports before they could metastasize into public scandal. Sitting there, in the quiet solitude of the basement room, Maya felt a cold realization settle deep within her bones. This was not the unconditional love of a devoted brother. It was an architecture of control, a fortress built upon the systemic silencing of accountability, where grace was never freely given, but rather purchased in installments by a man who needed everyone around him to remain perpetually indebted to his savior complex. Later that evening, beneath the flickering amber light of the kitchen pendant, Ethan laid bare the foundational trauma that had forged his father's bruised psyche into an instrument of tyranny. With a voice trembling against the weight of long-buried ghosts, he recounted the family lore of 1971, a year that hung over their childhood like a permanent, suffocating. It was the winter Arthur's father, a proud man broken by economic despair, was handcuffed at the kitchen table over a bounced $40 grocery check, his dignity stripped away in front of his terrified children for a sum so meager it felt almost cruelly absurd. That single, humiliating afternoon etched a raw, festering wound into young Arthur's soul. He had sworn a sacred, terrified oath to the empty ceiling of that tenement apartment that never again would anyone bearing his blood be dragged before the merciless machinery of the law. Yet, in his pathological refusal to let history repeat itself, Arthur had transformed that $40 debt into a prison sentence for everyone who came after him. He weaponized his own childhood terror, converting past humiliation into a currency of emotional extortion, ruling his household not from a place of genuine protection, but from the tyrannical panic of a boy who was forever trapped in the shadow of a pair of silver handcuffs. Driven by a restless, aching need to measure the exact dimensions of his father's psychological architecture, Ethan climbed the steep, dust-choked stairs to the attic, his fingers brushing against the familiar cardboard boxes of a boyhood he had never truly owned. Buried beneath a yellowed stack of high school yearbooks, flipping through the brittle pages, his eyes caught on a meticulously calculated tally from the autumn of his 14th year. Exactly $211 earned through freezing morning bike rides delivering the local Gazette through sleet and biting wind. But across that column of numbers, slashing through his youthful labor with thick, impatient strokes of red ink, was Arthur's handwriting. A marginal note, scrawled in the margins like a decree from a feudal lord, declared that the funds had been requisitioned to pay for Serena's orthodontic braces. Staring at those crimson lines, Ethan felt the air rush from his lungs. The money he had sweated for, the blisters on his thumbs, the shivering anticipation of buying his first real camera, all of it had been quietly confiscated, without a word of consultation, transmuted into a porcelain. The realization struck Ethan not with a sudden flash of theatrical fury, but with the quiet, devastating clarity of a winter dawn breaking over a frozen wasteland. For more than 20 long years, he had walked through life believing he was the beneficiary of a fiercely protective father, wearing his subjugation like a badge of honor in a family that demanded absolute submission. Now, standing among the discarded relics of his youth, the agonizing truth unraveled before his eyes. Arthur had never been protecting Serena at all. He had been practicing an insidious, creeping form of psychological disenfranchisement, systematically transferring his pathological need for onto the next generation. A profound wave of grief washed over him. Grief for the boy who had surrendered his bicycle rides and his earnings for a phantom debt. followed swiftly by a fierce, unyielding resolve. Looking down at the red-inked ledger, his hands steadying as the fog of lifelong gaslighting finally cleared, he whispered an oath into the dusty attic air. He would break the generational curse right here, right now. He swore with every fiber of his being that he would never allow Maya, nor any future they built together, to become the next collateral damage in his father's theater of manufactured salvation. The breaking point arrived not with a thunderclap, but with the superficial chime of a smartphone notification on a quiet Sunday afternoon. It was a photo posted by Serena in the extended family chat group, captured against the sun-drenched backdrop of Cinderella's castle at Disney World. Beneath the glossy filter lay the bitter reality. Arthur had quietly liquidated a portion of his mother's dwindling medical fund to purchase first-class airfare and VIP resort passes for Serena and her delinquent partner, funding a magical kingdom vacation while refusing to contribute a single dime to Ethan's student loan refinancing. The hypocrisy of the family had finally reached its absolute grotesque apex, stretching the elastic band of tolerance until it snapped cleanly in two. There was no anger left in them, only a profound, crystalline pity for a dynamic built entirely on public performance and private misery. As Ethan gently reached out to take Maya's hand, the digital smiles on the phone screen felt miles away, like ghosts from an alternate time. They closed the chat window, turned their backs on the illuminated screen, and stepped out into the warm, unscripted light of their own authentic future. Arthur stepped into the sterile, fluorescent corridor of the newsroom, carrying a weapon disguised as a lifeline, a personal check for $9,000, intended to quiet a storm threatening. With cold precision, the newspaper's legal department moved like an unyielding tide. Before the ink on the paper could even dry, the chief counsel stepped forward, slipping the check into a transparent evidentiary envelope and sealing it with a sharp, definitive click. It was no longer a settlement. It was a pristine, undeniable confession of attempted bribery and obstruction in a major fraud case. In that room, Arthur's chosen weapon was stripped of power, transfigured into an unyielding piece of evidence, binding him to his undoing. Maya watched the transaction unfold, feeling a profound, quiet shift within her chest. A sudden loosening of the truth, she realized, could not be bought off or neatly folded into an envelope. It stood tall, defiant, and ready to reclaim the dignity stolen from her step by painful step, whispering that true redemption always begins where manipulation finally fails, illuminating the dark corners of the soul with an Later that afternoon, the telephone beside Maya's desk rang like an alarm bell, piercing the silence of her thoughts, carrying Arthur's smooth, chilling voice across the static-filled line. He offered no apologies, only a calculated web of intimidation designed to test the fragile boundaries of her newly found courage. With a chilling calm, Arthur warned her that when the case reached the courtroom, 6 blood relatives would stand under oath to swear that Maya had willingly lent her personal card to Serena, fabricating a narrative of sisterly generosity. He dismissed the falsehood with a terrifyingly casual rationale, declaring with absolute conviction that statement hung in the air like poison, attempting to weaponize the sacred bonds of kinship against her pursuit of truth. Yet, as she listened to the hollow threat echoing through the receiver, Maya did not cower or tremble as she once would have in her youth. Instead, a steady flame ignited within her chest, burning away the residual fear of familial betrayal. She understood now that their version of love was nothing more than an elaborate cage built from coercion and silence, and stepping outside of its iron bars was the only way to breathe clean, healing air, transforming her sorrow into an unbreakable shield of resilient integrity and grace, casting aside every shadow of doubt to embrace the brilliant dawn of a... As the dial tone hummed into emptiness, a heavy wave of nostalgia pulled Maya backward across the corridors of time, landing her squarely in the quiet, suffocating agony of her 16th summer. She closed her eyes and vividly remembered handing over her entire hard-earned savings from the local diner to her mother, using every single penny to pay the overdue electricity bill, just to purchase a fleeting moment of domestic peace. In exchange for that sacrifice, her mother had offered a single, conditional sentence meant to soothe. At least you never make things worse. That phrase had lived inside Maya's heart like a splinter for over a decade. A constant reminder that her primary value lay in her silence and her ability to absorb chaos without complaint. Sitting alone in the dimming light of her apartment, she experienced She realized, with piercing clarity, that her lifelong silence had never been a noble virtue or a shield of protection. It had merely been a quiet rental agreement, trading her authentic voice and self-worth for a fragile, counterfeit peace that was never truly hers to keep. The healing began right there, in the quiet stillness, as she gently gathered the broken pieces of her past and vowed never again to trade her emotional sovereignty for the hollow comfort of keeping others comfortable at her own expense, stepping forward into the radiant light of absolute. The following morning brought an unexpected delivery. a heavy, cream-colored envelope bearing Arthur's immaculate handwriting, enclosing a formal invitation to a Sunday family dinner. Inside, the note stated that Pastor Bill would preside over the gathering to help resolve all lingering conflicts internally, invoking spiritual authority to cloak their manipulative intentions. As Maya stared at the gilded lettering, the weight of the impending confrontation pressed heavily upon her shoulders, threatening to pull her back into the old cycle of emotional submission. Before she could spiral into doubt, Evelyn entered her workspace, placing a steady hand upon Maya's shoulder, with an expression filled with fierce, unwavering support. Looking deeply into Maya's eyes, Evelyn offered words of profound wisdom that served as an anchor in the storm. Do not walk into that room playing an investigative journalist. Tonight, you must walk in carrying the fierce, protective grace of a wife who knows her own worth. Maya realized that she did not need to wear the armor of a reporter to defend herself. Her greatest strength lay in her unshakable authenticity and the quiet, healing power of standing truthfully in her own power against every manipulative design, ready to face whatever trial awaited her under the guise of familial piety, with an open, fearless heart. Standing before her desk, as twilight painted the city in shades of amber and violet, Maya reached out and picked up her late father's heavy silver fountain pen, feeling its comforting, familiar weight anchor her soaring spirit. With deliberate, meticulous care, she opened her leather handbag and slipped inside 2 contrasting documents that would decide the fate of her future. The unyielding, unalterable affidavit containing the unvarnished truth. Each piece of paper represented a distinct choice between continuing a legacy of suffocating deceit or stepping courageously into the liberating light of absolute honesty and personal redemption. She zipped the bag shut with a firm, decisive motion that echoed softly in the quiet room, a sound that felt less like a Taking a deep, grounding breath, she squared her shoulders and prepared to step across the threshold into the intimidating arena of the family courtroom, knowing she was no longer the frightened girl who traded her voice for silence. Armed with her father's enduring spirit, an unbreakable sense of self-worth, and the healing grace of absolute truth, Maya walked forward into the night, ready to reclaim her life, her dignity. The dining room table was set with a macabre, immaculate precision, mimicking an Easter resurrection feast for 13 souls beneath the sterile glow of crystal chandeliers. Arthur had commanded this grand theater, adorning the long mahogany board with the sacred heirloom china of his late mother, Margaret. Delicate porcelain painted with faded forget-me-nots. In this suffocating atmosphere of forced grace, Arthur orchestrated the seating with calculated arrogance, placing Maya in the seat of supreme honor, directly to his right. A toxic gesture of supposed reconciliation. Right beside her water glass lay the pristine envelope containing the silence-buying check, and the meticulously fabricated. The room hummed with a fragile, hollow tension, every relative masking their quiet dread behind polite smiles and rustling silk, unaware that beneath the polished veneer, a tectonic shift was rumbling through the foundations of the ancestral home. Margaret's porcelain cups, meant to hold sweet communion, were instead echoing with the heavy ghosts of generations who had. But peace built on buried bones is never peace. It is merely a silent graveyard waiting for a storm to unearth the skeletons. Maya looked down at the paper beside her, feeling not fear, but a profound, healing clarity washing over her spirit, knowing that the final chapter of inherited captivity was about to be burned away by the uncompromising, beautiful fire of truth. Before Arthur could raise his glass to deliver a rehearsed monologue of patriarchal benevolence, Ethan stood up, his movement swift and resolute like a sudden lightning strike splitting a stagnant afternoon sky. The silence that fell over the 13 guests was absolute, pregnant with the heavy realization that years of quiet endurance had finally reached their breaking point. With deliberate, trembling hands, Ethan reached into his coat and pulled out 2 relics of a bruised childhood. A yellowed, ink-stained notebook detailing the $211 of petty debts his father had forced him to repay as a boy, and the official pawn ticket for his first guitar, surrendered to satisfy another manufactured family crisis. He walked silently to the head of the table and placed them both right in the center of Arthur's pristine, untouched dinner plate, resting heavily over the fine porcelain. Looking directly into his father's stunned, narrowing eyes, Ethan spoke with a voice stripped of all fear, carrying the resonant weight of hard-won redemption. I am done playing the sacrificial lamb in your theater of. It was an act of profound psychological liberation, a sacred reclamation of a stolen youth, where the victim chose to stop bleeding for an executioner's applause. The ledger and the ticket sat there like a tombstone over Arthur's appetite. A tangible reckoning of emotional bankruptcy laid bare before an audience of complicit witnesses. Signaling once and for all, seeking to salvage the fractured narrative, Pastor Bill leaned forward, invoking a sanctimonious sermon on the virtues of divine forgiveness and the Christian duty to bury the past under a cloak of unearned grace. But before his pious platitudes could soothe the escalating discomfort, Maya rose from her seat, a towering embodiment of unyielding truth and moral clarity. Her voice cut through the heavy air with the piercing grace of a cathedral bell, calling for a genuine awakening, unshackled by hypocrisy. You preach of forgiveness, Pastor, while demanding that the wounded absolve the unrepentant predator without a single word of genuine accountability, Maya challenged, her eyes sweeping across the stunned faces of the 13. The scriptures you selectively quote also command that thou shalt not steal, and true repentance has always required tangible restitution, not cheap theological band-aids. For decades, everyone sitting at this table has hidden behind polite religion and cowardly compliance, treating collective silence as a virtue. But let us be entirely clear. Your passive silence is not peace. It is active complicity in spiritual and emotional. The dining room seemed to shrink around her words, stripping away every layer of pious delusion that had protected their dysfunction for generations. It was a moment of profound spiritual healing, a courageous refusal to let holy words be twisted into chains, reminding everyone that true grace can only bloom where absolute honesty finally takes deep root in the human soul. Turning her unyielding gaze directly toward the patriarch, Maya dragged the darkest skeleton of the family closet into the blinding light of accountability, invoking the hidden tragedy of $40 back in 1971. You have styled yourself as the noble protector of this family for half a century, Arthur. But the truth is far more devastating, she stated, her voice steady and relentless. For 50 years, you haven't protected Serena. Instead, through your toxic coddling and weaponized guilt, you crippled her spirit and stunted her character, turning her into a perpetual victim while forcing everyone else to pay for debts she never had to face alone. The indictment hung in the air like a suffocating fog, exposing the rot at the core of their dynastic mythology. Arthur flinched as decades of carefully... It was an act of profound emotional healing, ripping open an infected wound that had festered in the dark for generations, so that true cleansing could finally begin. Maya's words did not come from a place of malice, but from a fierce, restorative love that refused to let another generation inherit a legacy built on enabling and cowardice. She laid bare the heavy toll of Arthur's tyranny, forcing every person at the table to confront the reality that enabling someone's weakness is the ultimate betrayal of their potential, and that true love requires the courage to let people face the absolute consequences of their own personal choices without ever shielding them from truth. With a calm, majestic poise that silenced the room completely, Maya reached into her pocket and pulled out her late father's silver fountain pen, a treasured heirloom of true integrity. In front of the 13 stunned witnesses, she pulled the official true fraud affidavit across the table, ignoring the pristine envelope entirely, and pressed it flat. With deliberate, sweeping strokes, She signed her name to the document, turning the fine fabric into a historic witness stand of absolute liberation. Arthur, shaking with incandescent rage and a shattered grip on his fading dominion, slammed his fists down and roared a final bitter disownment, banishing them from his bloodline forever. Yet, his fury sounded hollow and small, nothing more than the dying breath of an... Ethan stood tall, stepping behind his wife, and gently reached out to take her hand, in a quiet gesture of unbreakable solidarity and shared strength. Without a backward glance or a single word of regret, they turned their backs on the opulent dining room, walking hand in hand out of the gilded cage and into the liberating, beautiful light of an unwritten future. It was the ultimate healing, breaking the long-standing generational curse, not with vengeance or malice, but with the profound, quiet grace of walking away into the warm embrace of true, unyielding personal freedom that no family contract or dynastic threat could ever revoke from their healing souls. The fluorescent lighting of the courtroom cast a sterile, unblinking glare over the mahogany bench, mirroring the unyielding weight of accountability that finally settled upon Serena's shoulders. The prosecutor's voice resonated through the hushed chamber, methodically laying out the charges of deception and institutional complicity that had for too long. Yet, in the delicate balance of justice and mercy reserved for a first-time offender, the presiding judge offered a path forward rather than an absolute closure behind iron bars, a rigorous diversion program. It mandated 100 hours of grueling community service, alongside a stringent financial restitution obligation of $9,000. For Serena, this sentence was not merely the heavy burden of a compromised conscience began to lift, relieved by the sober, grounding reality of honest work and transparent amends. As she walked out of the courthouse, the crisp autumn wind brushed against her face, carrying the faint, intoxicating scent of fallen leaves and uncharted beginnings. She realized that redemption was not a gift bestowed upon the undeserving, but a steep, arduous mountain that must be climbed. The heavy courthouse doors closed behind her, sealing away decades of quiet rationalizations and false securities, and opening up a vast, albeit terrifying horizon where she finally stood fully accountable to her own reflection, ready to earn every single ounce of her earned grace, dignity, and profound personal liberation. When the golden hues of autumn painted the maple trees outside Maya's quiet suburban home, the sharp ring of the doorbell signaled a moment suspended in time. Standing on the porch was Serena, her hands no longer adorned with the empty privileges of executive status, but bearing the quiet calluses forged from long, grueling shifts at the local warehouse. With a steady, trembling breath, she reached into her worn coat pocket and drew out a crisp envelope, presenting the very first restitution check that she had earned entirely through the sweat of her own brow. In that profound silence, 50 years of generational silence, Maya looked down at the slip of paper, not with a triumphant smirk, but with a deep, healing recognition of humanity restored. Serena's eyes welled with tears as she finally dropped the heavy armor of denial she had worn for half a century. This check was more than mere currency or legal obligation. It was the tangible embodiment of penance, the first true bill. As the afternoon sunlight warmed the porch steps, the invisible chains binding their two families dissolved completely, allowing Serena to step across the threshold of genuine rebirth, finally understanding that true freedom begins the exact moment you choose to face your darkest mistakes head-on, with complete and unwavering moral courage. Back at the bustling newspaper office, the final echoes of institutional corruption were swept away as the financial department officially registered the full bank refund, closing a dark chapter that had stained the publication's archive. Human Resources swiftly executed the administrative closure, sealing Maya's employment file with a formal, unreserved letter. Evelyn, standing before her peers in the sunlit newsroom, took that historic document and placed it gently inside a sleek wooden frame. She carried it over to the central break room, hanging it prominently on the wall as a sacred monument to journalistic truth and moral resilience. It stood there as a silent guardian, reminding every reporter and editor who walked past that words carry the power to destroy or to elevate, and that the institution's true honor depends on its willingness to correct its own catastrophic failures. The framed letter became more than an administrative vindication. In that shared space of coffee cups and late-night deadlines, the apology breathed new life into the newsroom's culture, transforming a place of past betrayal into an enduring sanctuary where honesty, accountability, and professional courage would forever reign supreme, inspiring generations of future writers across the entire industry with unwavering grace and an unbreakable commitment to objective truth and human dignity. Far from the corporate towers and the chaotic echoes of the past, Ethan embarked on the most courageous journey of his life, the path inward, through weekly psychotherapy sessions. Seated in the quiet, supportive atmosphere of the counselor's office, he began peeling back the suffocating layers of denial, fear, and complicit silence that had weighed down his spirit for years. He learned to confront the ghosts of his choices on his private study desk at home. Right beside the polished keys of his car, he placed a small, unassuming object that served as a daily anchor. The leather-bound debt notebook containing the exact tally of $211. It was not positioned there to torment him with guilt, but rather to function as a gentle, unyielding reminder of the steep and bitter price of silence when conscience demands a voice. Every time he reached for his keys to start the engine, his gaze would rest upon that humble ledger, feeling the profound sting of accountability transforming into a source of inner strength. Through tears of release and moments of hard-won self-awareness, Ethan discovered that true healing does not come from erasing the past, but from looking your mistakes directly in the eye and choosing to build. Back inside her sunlit kitchen, Maya stood quietly by the doorframe, her gaze drifting upward to the simple leather handbag hanging peacefully on the brass hook, where it had rested through so many years of turmoil and silent endurance. Bathed in the golden afternoon rays that poured through the window, the bag no longer looked like a silent witness to a painful past, but rather like a serene, weightless smile graced Maya's lips as she breathed in the profound stillness that now filled every corner of her home. She realized with absolute clarity that she had bestowed upon her family the most precious and enduring lesson of all. True protection can never be forged in the dark shadows of secrecy or maintained through complicit silence. Rather, it must always begin with the courageous embrace of the unvarnished truth. The storms had finally cleared, leaving behind an atmosphere of crystal clear tranquility, where love, justice, and authenticity danced together in perfect harmony. As she touched the soft leather of the bag one last time, she felt a profound wave of gratitude wash over her soul, knowing that the long night of injustice had given way to a brilliant, unshakable dawn. Her family was whole, her spirit was free, and her home had finally become a true sanctuary of unbreakable peace, where every breath was a celebration of hard-won liberty and enduring grace.